And welcome once again to EWTN's Bookmark. I am Doug Keck, your host. Our special guest is Dr. Michael Augros, and his book is Who Designed the Designer? A Rediscovered Path to God's Existence. It's published by Ignatius Press, available through the EWTN Religious Catalog. Welcome, Michael, to EWTN's Bookmark. People who watch the network will have seen you on with Father Mitch back in September, I believe it was.
That's right.
This past September, talking about this for a whole hour. Now, your background's in philosophy. You know, is philosophy the area that we deal with when we're talking about the understanding of God? Why isn't it theology?
Good question. The difference is that theology, taken in the in the sense that, say, Thomas Aquinas would take it in the strict sense, would mean a study of God and creatures too, connected to God, in light of sacred scripture, so in light of divine revelation. Philosophy doesn't start with divine revelation. It in some ways points to it, but what it starts from is self-evident truths that come out of universally shared human experience.
And that's a way to be able to deal with people who aren't religious, right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
And be able to put proofs forward that they might accept, rather than saying, kind of like we deal with in the pro-life movement many times when they say,
correct, yeah.
Well, that's your personal faith belief about life, and the answer is it's really not. It's really scientific, but it's a way of not having to deal with it. Now you say a rediscovered path to God's existence. Why is it rediscovered? Why was it lost?
Yeah, good question again. It's rediscovered because it was it's in a way covered over, or maybe not exactly ever lost. It was never really made public, you could say, in the way that I think it ought to be. So I'm thinking of Thomas Aquinas' arguments mainly. So the 5 ways that he proves the existence of God at the beginning of his Summa Theologiae. Arguments like those have a kind of force that people don't see. And that's because they've never been made sort of, they've never been explained in detail at a popular level.
Do you consider yourself then a Thomist, basically?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. Now, why is it seems to be, and I'm a lay person who didn't pay that much attention to the church, certainly in the 60s and 70s, I was growing up, but it seems to be in retrospect that was so powerful inside the church and in thinking of the church seemed to wane in kind of the 60s, 70s, post-Vatican II.
Yeah, you're talking about Thomism now.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
and has that had also a negative effect of why we've come to what we've come to?
I think so. That's a loss. The church has never stopped recommending Thomas Aquinas as the top theologian. So even in as recently as Fides et Ratio, you'd read in there, and there the Holy Father John Paul II, Saint John Paul II, was recommending a number of other theologians too, but just special place goes to Thomas Aquinas. And there's his own encyclicals were heavily influenced by Thomas Aquinas, Veritatis Splendor and so on.
Now you dedicated this book to your mother and father with a quote from Thomas Aquinas. How do those connect?
Yeah. Well, that one's out of, maybe for more than one reason there's a connection, but Thomas is there talking about how the relationship between child and parent is like the relationship between man and God. It resembles it in a number of ways. So I dedicated it to my parents, partly to honor them, of course, but also specifically because my father's also a Thomist. So a lot of what I am is just from him. Okay, good.
At a certain stage, you talk about how to take this book, and you kind of set it up. At a certain stage in the development, my children asked why about everything. We all experienced it. That often this was just a stall tactic. It's time for bed, and it was followed by why. But you go on to say, ultimately we wonder, is there a first cause of all things? Does every cause rely on a prior cause, or is there something that stands in need of no cause but just is? Well, we always say, there's got to be someone who starts, but then they say, then who started the start? The chicken and the egg theory.
Yeah.
I know you mentioned that in the book. How do we explain that?
Yeah, well, that's good. The chicken and the egg thing, actually, but this might come as a surprise, but and this is part of the whole rediscovering thing, that people lost this idea from St. Thomas. The chicken and the egg thing, you're actually looking at a series of causes going back in time. And Thomas Aquinas isn't thinking about that at all when he's proving the existence of a first cause, a first beginning of all things. He actually thinks you can't prove that there's a beginning in that order. He thinks we know there is from Revelation. We know that the world had a beginning in time thanks to God telling us so. But if it weren't for that, philosophy couldn't get you there. So Aristotle actually believed the world had always been here. and thought there was a chicken before every egg and an egg before every chicken. But he thought also from that very fact, he could show there has to be a cause of this eternally existing world because it's full of change and needs explanation. So there's some kind of eternal cause eternally producing this world. That's your first cause. But now you asked in there also the question, how do we know that, that there's a first? Why can't you ask what came before that? There you sort of need a principle that wherever you've got a bunch of things that depend on each other, there's got to be something that explains it all that doesn't depend on anything further. So for example, let's say you've got light shining into the room from a mirror, right? And then the light comes to that mirror from another mirror, and then from another mirror, and so on. Can that go on forever without a light source? Well, I don't care if you've got an infinity of mirrors, you've got no light unless there's a light source. So that's what this first cause means. It means the source of everything. So if there's not that, there's nothing.
Well, this is almost everyone with a definite opinion agrees that there must be some sort of first cause. Then you say most atheists, especially these days, believe in some underlying matter or energy or basic force.
Yeah.
So they don't disagree that there's a cause, they just argue over what the cause is?
That's right. So they would agree there is a first cause. Richard Dawkins would agree with that, I think. But he'd say it's something physical and material that everything's made out of. It's something natural. And that's where Thomas Aquinas would say, well, that can't be right because a first cause would have to be something unchangeable. He'd give arguments for that. But,
Now you also say, in arguing, as opposed to getting what is it, perhaps we should suppose the first cause to be intelligent. And is that your position, that the first cause has to be intelligent, it's just not some matter of energy or something?
Yeah, that's correct, yeah. And the way that, there's more than one way to come to see that, okay? One way, briefly, is to look at the beauty of the universe and say, it's beautiful both to the senses and to the mind. It's got an intelligible beauty to it. There's really no explanation for that if you think that the world is blind and mindless and that's all there is. Why is it so rich with things to offer to knowers, to people like us? That's like a giant coincidence, and in fact physicists sometimes puzzle over that and say, one thing we can't explain with our equations is why the world is so wonderfully explainable with equations. Why would that be?
Why does it seem to make sense?
Yeah, exactly. Now, so if you'd say that's not just a coincidence, but we're looking for a reason for that, seems like the only reason you can give is, well, it's produced by a mind, by something that has an appreciation for the beautiful and the intelligible, and is in a way making the universe addressed to minds like ours.
Well, you list some vexing questions here about how we deal with the human mind, about the first cause. You say the purpose of this book is to put forward a solution to these vexing questions. Specifically, my intention is to show by purely rational means, that there is indeed a first cause of all things and that this cause must be a mind. And then you go on to list the 5 reasons. And the first one, you say, this book takes a fresh, non-polemical approach to the question of design. What do you mean by non-polemical?
Okay, so a lot of books out there, there are a lot of great books out there about God's existence, but a lot of them are starting with the atheists, with what they say, and their whole point is to show, here's the weakness in the atheist position, here's what's wrong with that argument that they give, and so on. So the focus is all on the atheists. And that's a good kind of book to be. I don't think that's a bad thing. But this book, my book, is not like that. Instead, it begins with the person who's open and who's interested, or even who already believes in God, but who wants to see, how can I know in a rational manner that there is a God? So it takes that approach instead.
And number 2, this was one that I thought was interesting. It slowly and carefully develops a single proof for the existence of mind behind the universe. Because I know you talk about in the book that you end up with people who have got these multiple proofs and things like that. And you wanted to take the one. Why did you want to take that approach?
Good question. I mentioned the 5 ways of Thomas Aquinas earlier in the Summa Theologiae. They're really short. You could, if you made the print small enough, you could still read it. You could fit it all on a postcard, basically. It's not a whole lot of talk in there, but it's really dense argumentation that makes sense to nobody if they haven't had a whole lot of training beforehand. So I think what needs to be done is not to summarize the arguments of St. Thomas. You need the opposite. They need to be expanded. So I tried to take a single line of argument and expand it, and I thought it would be less confusing to readers, at least that was my hope,
right,
if I went down one road instead of offering a whole
myriad
exactly.
shotgun approach.
There
you
you
also
go.
say in number 3, you want to have reasons exclusively from things you can verify for yourself.
Yeah.
How do you go about proving the existence of God or design by things you can verify yourself? Because at the end of the day, isn't there some level of faith involved?
Okay. Thomas Aquinas had a wonderful distinction that he drew that's helpful there. He distinguished between the articles of faith and what he called the preambles to the articles. Mm-hmm. Okay, so the articles of faith would be things that you if you accept them on faith. There's no other way of getting them. Okay, mm-hmm. So the Incarnation, the Trinity, the Eucharist, on and on. Mm-hmm. But the existence of God, he did not put on that list. Okay. He'd say that's something you can know by reason, and you get a sign of that in Scripture when St. Paul says the people who are denying God's existence and his perfections and so on are without excuse, because these things are clearly seen in the things that have been made. Mm-hmm. So he seems to be advocating there or endorsing a kind of argumentation, philosophical argumentation for God's existence.
Number 4, it solves certain fundamental problems of theism. What problems are there with theism?
Good question, yeah. One of them is implied in the title of the book, Who Designed the Designer? That's not just the who made God question, which you and I have already just discussed briefly and in some ways settled, mm-hmm. But it's a little more complicated than that. This is a problem that Richard Dawkins and others put forward. They say if God is a mind who designed things and things need a designer because they're complex, mm-hmm. well, wouldn't a designer have to be even more complex? And so the designer himself would all the more need to be designed. Mm-hmm. So a designer doesn't get you, it gets you in an infinite regress. And that's exactly what we don't want. We want an ultimate explanation. So you need something simple like matter instead. So that's an example of a problem. Mm-hmm. There are other problems too that come up in the book, like how do you reconcile divine omnipotence and divine omniscience? How do they go together? If God knows everything, and he can't be mistaken, then he knows what he's going to do next Tuesday. That's the sort of idea there. But then if he knows what he's going to do next Tuesday and can't be wrong about it, he also can't change his mind. Mm-hmm. So now he's not omnipotent anymore. So you have to choose. It's one or the other. So that's another example.
If he lives in time, that is.
Yeah, you see, that's the thing is a lot of these problems, they actually come from anthropomorphizing God, who are sort of recasting him in human form and assuming certain things are true about him that are actually...
Rather than all things being present at once.
Yeah, that's right.
Which is even where it comes into the sacrifice of Calvary and the Mass.
Sure, yeah.
Touching into that, right? Mm-hmm. You say, I do not, and it was number 5, the certainty reached in this book is greater than the attained in science-based books for or against the designer. But I jumped down. I do not aim to defeat the atheists, except secondarily, and by the way, the spirit animating this book is not one of attack or defense or even persuasion as much as a spirit of wonder. Why did you want to make that point?
Yeah, because that has to do with what you were asking earlier about the non-polemical nature of the book. So if somebody wants to see the atheist just sort of getting punched one, two, chapter after chapter like that kind of thing comes up, but it's not the main purpose. So the main spirit of the book is a desire to understand.
Well, you deal with like Hawkins and Christopher Hitchens later on in the book, and though you do have a term for them that isn't the most positive, they don't get ignored, but it's not your major focus, like you say here.
That's right, yeah.
You talk about, here you will find a meticulous, fully spelled out investigation of the first cause presented in the manner of slowly unfolding the story. Elsewhere you say, I will never ask you to believe in someone else's findings or observations.
Yeah, that's right.
Do you think sometimes that's why people say, well, that's, I can read this or see this, but I don't agree with it, especially today?
Yeah, that's right. So I'm really trying to work from common ground, but also that's in some ways in contrast to the science-based books that are theistic, mm-hmm. which are good books. So those kinds of books and the philosophy books, I think, are complementary. They're not fighting with each other. They shouldn't be anyway. But I'm not doing that other kind of project. The science-based ones, there you're in the position. One of the disadvantages, of that kind of book is that you're asking your reader to believe certain results from cutting-edge science, mm-hmm. And take your word for it. Also, those results, they sometimes change. The cutting-edge science of today might be overturned 10 years from now. Well, some of it will be anyway.
Well, that's interesting because obviously, ultimately, the truth stays the same. But if you go back 100 years or 200 years is like saying, would you want a doctor who was trained 100 years ago to be operating on
Yeah,
you?
right.
Now, at the time, they thought they knew everything that there was to know, and obviously they didn't. So we can't always be so sure just because that's what science says today. Now, we talked about Richard Dawkins, and the opponents kind of to our position reply by saying that design thinkers have argued against a straw man. They go on to say many atheists instead maintain that organic things are the nearly inevitable products of the known laws of things like atom jostling, albeit by a yet unknown intermediate process. What is the straw man that they try to say many people are attacking?
Yeah, at least you mentioned Richard Dawkins. He'd say the people who look at the atheist view, the materialist view, and say, we say everything's by chance, they say, no, we don't say that. We say that everything's by natural laws that behave in a regular manner.
Right.
And yes, chance is kind of a tool used by those laws in some ways, you could say, to bring about cumulative greater and greater effects among living things especially. But we don't really say that, lions and tigers pop out of the ground by chance. That's
right, or that 747s just miraculously put themselves together.
Yeah, we don't say things like that.
Okay, but this was a question: what qualifies something to be an ultimate explanation?
Yeah, okay, that's a good question. Now, what's funny there is that I tend to agree with Richard Dawkins that what qualifies something to be an ultimate explanation is simplicity. So not having lots of different parts put together or different components that are combined in certain ways, that's what makes a being. If you can have a being that's just completely simple, that's what's required in order to be an ultimate explanation. Why is that? It's because, you could put it this way, if something has parts that are put together, then something put it together. So that can't be an ultimate explanation. Right. But Richard Dawkins, we part ways when we talk about what that simple thing is. He thinks it's something like a basic matter, something like that, material of some kind, energy, whatever, something in the natural world. Whereas Thomas Aquinas would say, that's not simple enough. That has parts too that are combined in some way. Okay. God is the only thing that's perfectly simple, has no parts at all.
That's interesting. You think here's God and he's the most simple thing.
Yeah,
in a way, that's interesting.
Complex. We think of him as complex because our thoughts about him are complex. Yeah, but he's not complex, and he doesn't do a whole lot of thinking to understand himself. He's just got one thought by which he understands himself.
Now, you make the point that your method of reasoning is mainly deductive. And by deduction, I mean a form of reasoning in which the conclusion must be true as long as the premises are, versus inductive reasoning. Why did you want to make that point?
Yeah, because not a lot of people go around deducing things. That's why. So even the way of
Sherlock
reasoning.
Holmes or something?
Yeah, well, in a way, that's the kind of thing that I wanted to appeal to say, you've heard of this kind of thing, you just might not do it a lot. So on any given day, we might in fact perform an induction, though we don't call it that. We see lots of similar cases of something and then draw a general conclusion that this fast food restaurant's no good, that one's no good, that one's no good. Hey, maybe fast food restaurants are no good, right? That's the kind of, everybody draws those kinds of conclusions. But deduction is more certain, because it might be there's a fast food restaurant that is good, right? There's one that I didn't check out. So induction is not as absolute. Deduction just is a form of reasoning. If the premises are true, the conclusion has to be true. There's no way out of it. And so I wanted to familiarize the reader with that in case they weren't familiar with that.
Now, are aliens real?
I'm going to say what I said to my daughter when she asked that. I really don't know. I'm up in the air on that one.
And then your son said, Dad, of course aliens aren't real. Aliens are monsters, and monsters aren't real.
And that's a deduction.
Okay.
Yeah, there you go. So the premises there, I don't know whether they're true or not, but the conclusion necessarily follows if the premises are true. So I wanted the reader to see in this book, if you agree with the premises, the kind of reasoning going on here, you can't say, I agree with those premises, I just don't agree with the conclusion. You're being illogical if you do that. And it's okay to say I disagree with the premises, but if you agree with the premises, you have no choice. The laws of logic force you.
Okay, are all bachelors or drunks?
Yeah, there's an example of a generalization. Yeah. And so that's opposed to the kind of principle that I want to use in the book, which is not a mere generalization, but something that you can see has to be true without exception.
And saying, but not all general statements are generalizations. So
yeah.
That's what you're talking about, right?
That's right, yeah.
You say most of what you will encounter in the upcoming chapters has been shamelessly stolen from Thomistic philosophy, that is the philosophy of Thomas Aquinas. And you kind of explain really why that was such an important thing for you to. Who's Mr. Monteith?
He's a physics teacher I had in high school, and he was the first person to help me see that at least my understanding of of an argument for God's existence from the Big Bang, that there had to be a beginning there. My understanding of that was fairly shallow and naive, and I needed to think more about that. I'm still thinking about that today, and Father Robert Spitzer and others are writing books about...
Smartest man I know.
There you go, along those lines, right? So, but my understanding of that at that time as a high school student, that physics teacher was able to help me see that I really didn't see that there has to be a God yet. I wasn't there yet. And then I started thinking more about first causes because of that, and then I found Thomas Aquinas, who had a very different way of thinking about first causes. So anyway, that's how the book begins.
Yeah, elsewhere in the book's move ahead, what first cause means and what it doesn't mean. And you say, is it possible for a cause to set something in motion and then stop acting?
Yeah.
I mean, is that sort of what the way sometimes the big clockmaker in the sky kind of thing in a way is? Well, he set it in motion and then guy went away.
Deism, the
deistic
kind of a
sort
deistic
approach,
so
or he's not really involved. He might be out there, but he doesn't really care what we do.
Yeah, so that's again that connected to that thing we were talking about with the chicken and the egg and so on. The kind of causation that St. Thomas is talking about in his arguments is stuff that's going on continuously. He's talking about something that's causing something to come to be or causing it to be for as long as it's coming to be or for as long as it is. And so that's something that doesn't go away. It doesn't just get the thing started and then disappear. So you could say that the first cause that this book is about gave itself a name in Scripture, He Who Is. And I remember reading that for the first time as a kid and thinking, that's a really weird name for God. Why would he say that to Moses? I'm the one who is,
right.
Or I am, that's my name.
Right.
Say, I am too, so how's that special? How's that your name, God? How's that distinctive? But when you think about it more, you realize with the help of people like Thomas Aquinas that what God is saying is, I'm the one who has existence just by myself. The rest of you have it on loan from me. I'm giving you existence as long as you are. So I think St. Paul has that line, in whom we live and move and have our being. So he's not saying that, St. Paul is not saying that God gives us being and then we are, and now we don't need God anymore.
Right.
As long as you are, you're coming from God, as long as you exist. That's the kind of thing that this book is trying to establish.
Now, you grew up in New Hampshire, so you're familiar with snow.
Oh, yes.
What's the lesson of the snowball you talk about in here?
Yeah, how to say it? That goes back to what we were talking about earlier about complexity. What I wanted to show in that little lesson of the snowball was, well, if you take snow and you pack it together, do you get a snowball out of it? It depends on the snow.
Right. Is it good packing snow or is it dry snow?
Yeah.
You need wet snow.
Yeah, that's right. So the lesson there is, if something stays together after it's been put together, there has to be a reason for it. It's not enough to say you put things together so now they're going to stay together. Well, sometimes things don't stay together when you put them together, which means when they do stay together, there's got to be a reason for that for as long as they stay together. So that's the beginning of starting to see that when things come to be, and then they continue to exist after that, even though there's nothing bringing them to be anymore, it might very well be that you still need a cause for their continuing to be after that.
In Beyond Imagining, you talk about the fallacy of the elephant.
Yeah.
What is that?
Yeah, that's this goes back again to what we were saying about anthropomorphism. So God is an invisible and incorporeal being. Okay, he doesn't have a body. Now, we're not talking about the incarnation here, but the divine nature. Okay, God doesn't have a body. That's not imaginable. It's difficult for us to think about a thing like that because we're strongly dependent on our senses and imagination. So a lot of people tend to reject the whole idea. Lucretius, for example, and other thinkers before him say there can't be anything that's not a body. It would have to be non-being because it couldn't do anything. And what can't do anything isn't anything. So how could it work on this table? It couldn't touch it because it doesn't have a body, so it couldn't do anything to it. And I compare that to an elephant, saying that there can't be any other animals in existence other than elephants, because if there were, they wouldn't be able to do anything because they wouldn't have trunks. So you say, well, that's pretty elephant-centered thinking.
Right, kind of self-limiting there.
Yeah, and I think there's something similar going on when we say if something doesn't have a body, then it can't do anything. Well, it can't do anything the way a body does things by contact, but it can do things maybe in some other way.
Now, how many books have you written? Is this your first
This
one?
is my first published book, that's
Okay,
right.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now, you went to Boston College, is that what you went?
I did. I went to
Okay.
Boston College, got a PhD in philosophy
Did you have
there.
Peter Kraft at all when you were
I
there?
did, yeah. And he says some nice things about the book on the back,
I'm
which
sure
I was very happy
I'm sure
about.
he does. He's great. So how long did it take you actually, once you decided to write this book, to sit down and put it together, and when do you write?
That's a really interesting question. When do I write? Like what time of day kind of question?
When do you find the time to write?
Well, I'll start with that one. I like to work in the morning. That's my best time. The older I get, the less awake I am towards the evening. I used to be able to stay up all night. I can't do it anymore. In grad school, I went to bed at 3 a.m. all the time. So.
Oh, yes, those halcyon
heady
days of youth.
they're gone. So I tend to write in the morning. But then, as to the other question, writing this book, the idea came when I started to realize this was before 2000. This was 2003 is when I started really working on the book. That's a long time ago.
That's 13 years ago.
Yeah. Now the reason that's so long ago is because and that's 3 years I think before Richard Dawkins' book came out. So you can see it wasn't a response book.
Okay.
What motivated it was learning more about St. Thomas's 5 ways, seeing how wonderfully powerful they are, how beautiful they are, and I wanted them to be more accessible to people. But then I started working on drafts of trying to work that out, and what I found was making that accessible was not easy.
That's right. God may be simple, but Aquinas is difficult.
That's right.
We're just out of time. Thank you so much, Michael Augros.
Thank you.
Author of Who Designed the Designer? A Rediscovered Path to God's Existence, published by our friends at Ignatius Press, available through the EWTN Religious Catalog. An enlightening work. Check it out. Join us next time right here on Bookmark.